Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm your host, Mike Reid. The show is called Scotch and Scholars, and tonight's scholar is Dr. Daniel J. D'Amico. Dr. D'Amico is the Associate Director of the Political Theory Project at Brown University, and he's also the author of numerous research papers, mostly on the rise of mass incarceration in the West, and he has the lead essay in Cato Unbound this month, and it's entitled Why Nations Jail. Dr. D'Amico, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, man. Great to be here. Although I'm in my own room, so.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here with you as well. We often hear that the United States has the world's largest prison population, both in absolute and in relative terms. And I understand that you've connected this with the particular methods used for drug prohibition in the United States. Is there something unique about the way the US government carries on the drug war as compared to other countries that accounts for the prison population?
Well, I mean, first is that we carried on sort of at all. Prohibition in other legal jurisdictions around the world is not a war in any meaningful sense. So I mean, it's ironic that the United States has titled its experience in prohibition in contemporary America as a war on drugs, because it's very fitting. It's a very accurate title. Wars are launched at the federal level, just like many of the other wars that we engage in. This one's relatively unconstitutional, and primarily an expression of advanced executive power. And so that's like the crux of my claim in that essay, and sort of the general thing that I'm working around in my research right now, which is there's a lot of facets to what economists call institutions that relate to economic performance. One of those could be like the compatibility culturally between an institution. We can imagine a society that's just sort of morally opposed to markets, or their like obscure beliefs just don't meld really well with private property rights. And in that circumstance, the institutions of like contract law and like civic adjudication wouldn't work well. Like you'd have to like learn how markets work before you would expect economic performance. So that's one margin. But another margin is the qualitative features of the institutions themselves. Some legal systems work better than others for certain purposes.
Okay.
And I'm trying to focus in my research, that's what I think is going on, that our political and legal system, like the way we make laws, not the particular details of the laws themselves, the way we make laws in the United States, the organization of power between the federal government relative to the states, is the sort of the fertile spawning ground for why things like the drug war can foment so significantly in our experience relative to others. Other nations have this similar trait going on, right, to a lesser extent. They're less wealthy, they're less diversified, but insofar as they award their sort of national authorities relative to their local authorities a lot of discretionary power when it comes to criminal justice, then they incarcerate in proportion to that centralization.
It's not just specifically like the rules about how many grams of marijuana you're allowed to have before you're carrying. It's more about the centralization of judiciary power in the society as a whole.
Right. You're going to get those rules when the system is more hierarchically oriented, is my thesis. And I don't think that, I mean, like my thesis, that's not really my thesis. That's what I would argue is sort of the essence of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism was a scientific enterprise that linked prosperity to the competitive network of the market economy. And it wasn't like, I know that like libertarians, we like liberty. Like there is a sort of cultural and aesthetic value of liberty, but in its like sort of originary presentation, it wasn't really about that so much. It was more just a description of what was going on, and the science behind it was really about the structure, that the environment for competition had value for and predictable relationship to the outcomes that you get from it. You don't get a division of labor without sort of free entry and free exit. It's great that there's like an ideological movement that now appreciates freedom, but that's not really what's doing the heavy lifting. It's a structural issue.
Right, deeper, harder to see kinds of things. This reminds me of something that you said last year with Jeffrey Tucker on a Liberty.me live show, and you guys were talking about the sense of axiomatic approach to liberty, the non-aggression principle, and so on, in a sort of in a sense of thick versus thin libertarianism. And you responded to Jeffrey that you weren't motivated or driven by this approach to liberty itself, but merely from your studies show that liberty is, I think you say, the most explanatory variable in social change. Like liberty is what makes the good stuff happen. If you like peace, you like prosperity, liberty is what makes it work.
Yeah, in the thick or thin debate, I think of myself as zero-dimensional, like non-existent. I don't think that the level of freedom in society rests upon how many libertarians there are. I think there is an extent where ideology matters, but it's predominantly the relevant factor of ideology is how society writ large approbates or feels about commerce and profit. If we live in a society where people say that person's rich, therefore he's an asshole, that's a problem. If we live in a society where people say getting rich is something to aspire to, that's probably going to be better. But promoting those different moral norms is not about populism. It's not about like, oh, convince your family, friends, and loved ones to be libertarians. It's instead requires like real comprehension of how social outcomes relate to free entry and exit. So, I mean, one way to think about this is I hear like catchphrases and stuff thrown around activist groups or sort of social libertarian events where people are like, man, we're not going to change the world sitting around reading like Man, Economy, and State, like go run for office or like plan a protest or like, I mean, the gamut
to New Hampshire.
It's like the underwear gnomes theory of social change. It's like first steal all the underwear, then profit. Like what those things don't relate in any meaningful way. But I actually like deny it. I like the whole claim is backwards if you really understand like what Hayek's saying and all these other things. Maybe the types of people who are currently sitting around reading Man, Economy, and State or whatever aren't going to change the world. But if everyone woke up tomorrow and actually comprehended intuitively, like they actually knew what they were talking about, the concepts of economics, that would lead to more systemic social change than if everyone woke up and said, I really love the idea of freedom just cause.
So to me, it seems like in my admittedly shallow reading of Hayek, you're actually backwards. I mean, I thought Hayek's claim is that people don't really need to understand how the social system works for it to work pretty darn well. We depend on the glimpses of knowledge we get from one another. We carry on our lives buying tin and selling tissue paper.
That is true in the free society.
Okay.
I think it's not true in an environment that allows the expression of ignorance through the political process. Okay, so you're right. Like the donuts will get made regardless of our comprehension of the broader system.
Right.
But so long as we have a political apparatus that messes up the works all the time, it's going to mess up the works for whatever it is that people want it to mess up the works for. Like you're not going to have a constitutional or an effective constitution, something where governance is designed to limit the power of government, unless most people recognize that government represents the greatest potential threat to the otherwise functioning system that operates on limited ignorance.
Okay, so can we do some, like a specific example? There's been so much, like over the last few years, in the news about policing practices, incarceration practices, botched lethal injection procedures, Ferguson, Baltimore. I'm thinking of Homan Square in, I think it's Chicago. Can we take a specific example where people are seeing in their daily lives excessive incarceration, and so on, and figure out how it kind of descends from the political structure that we live in, or our centralization of power?
So conventionally in the course of the 20th century, what you've seen is local level bias, right? In a system that's supposed to be blind, right? Justice isn't supposed to be structural based on your race, your age, your wealth, whatever. But the reality of the system is like a podunk town in Alabama or whatever is probably going to have instances where people are going up for trial against jurors who are racists, and that's probably not just.
Right.
The response to that throughout the way our system was set up was that we would revoke authority from the local level and submit it to the federal authority.
Right.
That sounds like it makes some sense, but there's no guarantee that the federal level is necessarily more aligned to the interests of subjugated minorities than the local level was. It's probably going to manifest itself in a different way. So what I say in the Cato Unbound piece is that Ferguson and Baltimore and stuff, these are the worst of both worlds. We've got a bias, a prejudice, a racism expressed at a local level where like a cop shoots a guy, and that's a travesty, and it's really terrible. And then the response in terms of federal reaction to the protests and the outrage is this sort of hyper-militarized SWAT team crowd control, right? And that's a product very much of the financing and the incentives that are coming down from the national level. So that's the unintended consequence of saying, dear federal government, come fix us local level authority from these local level racists. There's no guarantee that, I mean, what the federal government does well is war. So we get a militarized, and by well, I mean like technologically efficient.
Right.
They make lots of guns and tanks and stuff like that. It's a very effective production function for political interests.
Mm-hmm.
You are not going to grow a well-operating community based on trust and like racial harmony or class harmony with tanks, right? Or Kevlar or tear gas. Like, these are just not good equipment for the task that needs to be done at hand. It's one thing to say that there's problems with the way the local level is administering social order. I can agree with that. I can agree that, say, yes, like local level law enforcement has prejudices and biases and stuff like that. But there's a default strategy of turning to federal authority to fix those problems. But there's no real reason to believe that the federal authority is effective at fixing those problems, because the federal authority, I mean, it's like you have a cold and you go to the gun shop. That, I mean, they just sell and produce different things. It's not very effective. So I mean, that's one sort of example. I think in addition to that, this sort of claim that I was making earlier about social change and the confusion of the libertarian movement, and my topic of incarceration. Incarceration is a good example of this social change theory at play, it isn't necessarily the case that raising awareness and building solidarity in activist groups and whatnot is going to solve the problem if the likely and predictable response of growing these activist bases is a greater representative response from federal government. I mean, that's the predictable outcome that you would expect. If you get a bunch of people across the nation to say, this is so bad, we need to do something about it, the only thing that the government can do is make a bunch of laws, do a bunch of what it already does.
More handcuffs, more tasers, more tanks.
Right. And the nature of what the national government does is actually at odds and part of what's causing the problems in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. So now it seems like the work you do, it always seemed to me, it stands like at a crossroads between libertarian or classical liberal analysis of how institutions really work, and also the specific kind of institution you focus on and the discourse you engage with. There's so much interest in there from a post-structuralist, postmodernist, Foucaultian approach, which is typically seen as a sort of leftist, quasi-socialist.
I get this rep for being the like Foucault appreciator of like libertarians just because I've read it.
Okay,
I liked it.
Can you give us like a 2-minute who Foucault is and why libertarians should care?
Yeah, Foucault is a crazy person that college students really like reading because it's complicated. So when you're smart and you're in college and your teacher assigns this and you're the smart kid in class, you can follow it in a way that everybody else can't, and it makes them look stupid and you look smart.
So it's a status game. That's what reading
Foucault is. I think that post, my colleague, friend, heterosexual life partner, Adam Martin, and I, we coin it obscurantist epistocracy. And what that means is like you learn a language of bullshit and you can sort of navigate it better than other people. And so you give awards to people who say like all the buzzwords in a meaningful way compared to other people. Foucault's very guilty of that, I think. But that being said, the facets of his work on incarceration that are good are substantively different than public choice. So Foucault notices that incarceration in its like historical invention represents this sort of turning point in state power from punishment practices used to be very public. They'd like hang people in the town square. And when modern legal systems developed, everybody thought, oh, well, this is so much more humane and rational and all of these other things. But what it really did was it took that procedure out of the public realm and then hid it away. And so the state had a greater opportunity being out of sight to get away with some really shady shit. And if you're just tracking like beheadings in the town square, the trend line goes down.
Right.
You have to sort of like measure something more abstract like coercive violence,
right,
and be able to like track it in all of its unique ways. So we no longer live in just the mass incarceral phenomenon, but like the types of incarceration are changing. We have a lot more solitary confinement. We have a lot more sort of because of the mass, we have a lot more race conflict within prison systems, as well as an inability to cope with aging populations, let alone like transgendered rights within prisons. I mean, this huge bureaucracy is just terrible at dealing with the diversity of our citizenship. Right. And then we also have, I mean, like everything from waterboarding to like Guantanamo style stuff, where the sort of visceral nature of punishment techniques at the hands of otherwise like the best forms of government we know of, right? Not to say anything great about democracy, but it's better than totalitarianism. But totalitarian regimes we're not responsible for the most innovative forms of torture that we've seen in the 20th century.
Ew. Great. That's a really great explanation of who Foucault is and why mostly you can read Public Choice instead of him.
I mean, you can read a lot of stuff instead of Foucault. Brian Kaplan had a great quip in grad school. He always said, long walk, short drink. So it's like you're turning pages and pages and pages of these like run-on sentences that are hard to keep track of.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're like, here's the hook.
Yeah, it's like 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, like someone could just say, well, states are nefarious, and if you cut off one avenue of them being jerks, they're going to find another avenue. I mean, that's Foucault in a nutshell, which is just to say that like any ideological movement, any economic system, anything is going to exist within some sort of power dynamic.
Right.
And that power dynamic, it's sort of a hunt to find how it's expressing itself.
Okay, so I want to go now to a related question from the audience, maybe closer to what you were saying earlier about your vision of how social change actually proceeds. And this comes from Derek Dahlman. And Derek asks, could you explain more how government could get away from criminal punishments? You mentioned in your summary about pirate societies which maintain civil order through contracts. What is your idea of a utopian method of handling incarceration, or maybe we should say more broadly punishment in a society?
Admittedly, I don't know. But I think that is the right answer, and the whole point. Let me give an example. When I started working on punishment, I was just concerned with the calculating challenge, like in an individual case. Like, how do we know how much to punish people?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know what the right price is? The answer of how do you know what the right price is I don't know. The answer to how much is an optimal punishment should also be I don't know. Strangely enough, whenever I lecture, I sort of envy monetary economists. Monetary economists, people like admit they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, so I don't know. But when you talk about something like justice, everybody thinks they know. So when I would talk about the ambiguities of criminal sentencing, very smart people, and some very dumb ones too, but people would be in the audience and they'd be like, well, clearly the response to child molestation should be X.
Right.
And X would always be like some sick, twisted, lunatic type stuff. Like, I wish I had like kept a like notebook and just filled pages with like, so-and-so said that we should like cover people in ants, and someone else said that we should cut fingers off one at a time. Like,
remarkably similar to the sort of spectacular punishments that Foucault opens his description of monarchical societies with. If
you let people pontificate about what their ideal punishment should be for a particular crime, sky's the limit. People say a smorgasbord of twisted practices. Only a very few subtle and humble Hayekians who I've talked to, when I've said, what do you think the optimal punishment for car theft should be, say, oh, I have no idea. And I think that should be the right answer. So that should be the foundational answer for saying, how do we replace the prison system? How do we de-incarcerate?
Right.
I mean, in the immediate sense, I don't know the answer, but I do think that the research and the science is suggesting something about what we know we should stop doing. Things like...
Do we really need to replace marijuana trafficking sentencing with anything? Maybe we should replace it with nothing.
I mean, that's what I mean by things we should stop doing. I mean, we clearly know that things like drug prohibition are not helpful in the current system. And secondly, we know that if we have environments that are trying to develop new institutions, most of like a huge number of countries around the world are underdeveloped or are in conditions of failed or weak states like the Middle East, Somalia, etc. We do have a lot to say about how to advise those environments, right? Like, don't do the mistakes that we just did. And I think that's a useful application, even if we don't know exactly how to tweak our current system to fix all of these problems. We know, oh, well, you've got a new society. Well, rest assured that you don't need a giant carceral apparatus in order to have an extended division of labor and an advanced market economy. That linkage is done. So, like, I mean, that's another sort of very policy relevant aspect of this research. There is no meaningful link, and this is where Foucault comes in again, because Foucault is very much culpable and responsible for arguing that capitalism, prosperity, industrialization, and incarceration are like these like bedfellows that are inherently tied. There's no empirical evidence that supports that whatsoever. None. I'm not the only one who's noticed that. Lots of people have noticed it, but everybody was like afraid that like, well, I can't just like say that postmodernism is like not a thing, but it's not a thing in this arena. Like, there's just no good evidence to suggest that economic performance or economic institutions or anything like that directly relates to incarceral trends. The most you can get is unemployment aspects, prosperity, liberal finance, like any of those things like don't directly relate. That's meaningful. It tells us that if we fix our mass incarceration issue, it won't sacrifice our economic performance. That's very important for people to understand. Secondly, it tells us that environments that don't have massive carceral states, they can grow their economic performance without growing their incarceral state. So I think both of those are very useful general things to know. The last thing that I think that I'm trying to sort of develop, and I've got a working paper on this now, are like some general constitutional rules of thumb that are implied from these insights, mainly that our criminal justice system probably worked better in its earlier history. And the reason for that is because of the organization of checks and balances that existed in our earlier history. So there's a political scientist by the name of Barry Weingast. He has this concept called market-preserving federalism. He talks about how the state's authority relative to the federal government authority and the competition that exists, the jurisdictional competition that exists between states is very good for tax policies and regulation policies.
Right.
And then the inability of like bailout or like those sorts of, like, when you have times when you get bailouts and you screw up the incentives, you get bad outcomes after the fact. But if you can send a credible commitment that whatever your budget is at the state level, the national government is not going to come and bail you out, you're going to get a better alignment of interests for policy decision makers to preserve market conditions.
So once again, we're seeing that decentralization is practical and key to the whole incentive structure that can get us a freer, more prosperous, more peaceful world.
So the big hook in Weingast is self-enforceability, right? If the government is constantly wanting to like screw over the Constitution and just do whatever it wants, it's going to be really hard to get it to work. So you have to figure out like what is the feature of the rule that makes it actually like effective, have teeth, you know? And so similarly, like, I don't know what that exactly looks like, but the principle is the same. That if you could apply federalism to the punitive process, I think that you would whatever it takes to preserve decentralization, we should do that. But admittedly, I don't know what would be ideal. I don't know what the legislation looks like or how to write it, or what political process of like, hey, a bunch of idiots vote for this would look like.
You should start a petition that says incarceration is bad, states are nefarious, not sure what would work better. Let's try some decentralization, and then just get people to sign.
Yeah, like vote for that. Like what? That's the state of our knowledge. I don't know. I love it when people are like, but there's no policy relevance to that. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, we don't know everything.
Daniel, Dr. D'Amico, thank you so much for coming to talk with us about your work in incarceration, about all the things really that we don't know, but also about the sense of a general structure in society that can lead to the things we're looking for, that sense of the importance of decentralization, or what do you call a competitive network. I want to, I got to start wrapping up, and I like to wrap up by doing three things. First, I'm going to tell people how to get more Daniel J. D'Amico. I'm going to give them a few links for other great stuff by you. Then I'm going to tell them how to get some more great stuff from Liberty.me, some more Liberty.me live shows coming up tomorrow and later on next week. And then finally, I'll turn it back over to you for the last word. So, how to get more Daniel J. D'Amico. There's a great 3-minute Learn Liberty video with him on the U.S. prison population and the drug war. It's right here. Go check that one out. That's a lot of well, I don't know if the topic can be fun, but it's definitely an eye opener. Here is the piece which really spawned our discussion today. Why Nations Jail. This is the lead essay in Cato and Bound this month. Go check that out. Looks like some of you guys, including Derek, have already read it. And finally, for the central hub of all things Daniel D'Amico, there is the website, danieljdamico.com. So go check that out too. Now, for more Liberty.me live, tomorrow night at 8 Central, we have the Future of Freedom, and that's Jacob Hornberger of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and he's talking with Scott Horton, and they're almost certainly going to talk about the rise of the drug war tomorrow night too. Then we've also got Politics After Dark later on tomorrow night. That's at 9:30 Eastern Time with Rachel Mills, ex-press secretary for Ron Paul. And she is talking with Norm Singleton and I think 2 other guys on a panel about kind of what happened to the Ron Paul movement. We've seen some arguments that the Ron Paul movement actually, in a weird way, sort of turned in to the quasi-conservative Tea Party or anti-immigration Donald Trump movement.
And maybe all in Black Lives Matter.
Pardon me?
I thought they're all in hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, maybe. And so I'm looking forward to that one tomorrow night. And then on Tuesday of next week at 12 o'clock Eastern Time, we've got Liberty in Europe, and they're doing an interview with Walter Block, who is admittedly not in Europe. But you got to have your mandatory Walter Block viewing. And so that comes up on Tuesday of next week. Lots more from Liberty.me Live, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you, everybody. That's all my promotional stuff. Now I'll turn it back over to Dr. D'Amico for the final word.
What do you want me to say for the final word?
What do you want to say for the final word? That's the whole idea.
That's a good question. I mean, to get back to the point about social change, I think one would be hard pressed to deny that the best way to spend marginal time, if you like truly care about liberty per se, is to educate yourself about how society works. And I don't just mean like read libertarian books. I mean, know social science, know what's actually going on in the world. I mean, we're surrounded by discussions of inequality that are relatively ignorant of economic history or the actual trends of wealth creation and distribution in the world. We're surrounded by conversations about that presume causes of things that we don't like mass incarceration or drug war, and we presume that caring is going to fix the problem, and the amount that we care should be put into the sense in which we're confident in our comprehension, more so than in our activism and outrage. If we get everyone who marches and pickets or whatnot to instead like double their knowledge, which isn't hard when you're coming from a really low place, about just even like, I'm going to sound like an empiricist or something, but like just the data, like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible. Like, well, how does it compare to the past? Are we on an upward trend, or are we on a downward trend? Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? What's different about the trends? Like, those are important things that I think are standard in academic discourse. Like to some extent, the peer review system is sort of bureaucratic and state controlled as higher education is. It's a very different experience, and I think there's a sort of sad life cycle of aspiring libertarian academics from like the undergraduate experience into the graduate school experience, and then the professorial experience, where you are exposed to a lot more scientific research and engage with a lot more informed people, and it reshapes the way you understand and think about a lot of these issues. And if there was a way to replicate some of that exposure for lay people in the movement, I think we would probably have a more effective movement, if that makes sense. And I'm often sort of criticized for implying that there's some sort of like ivory tower elitism to like libertarian activism or whatever. I don't mean to imply that. I just I don't think that that populism lends itself to liberty, which is, I mean, that's the sort of paradox. Like, I like liberty. That's like my personal bias. Like, I want to be free, mostly because I'm just an egomaniac and don't think that other people are smart enough to tell me how to live my own life. But that doesn't like suffice to change public policies or to change the world per se. I don't know if that's a good last word. I'm sorry.
It was like it's like the first word of like the next discussion is what it is.
Sure.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much again, Dr. D'Amico, for coming. This has been really interesting. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great night. I'll see you all soon on Liberty.me Live.